Sweden. I love Sweden. I won't be shy about telling you that. I think much of what happens here is a model for the world. And I'm really, really delighted to have had this opportunity to be here for the last couple of days. And I want to talk about four things that I think relate to some of the issues that we've been talking about. I'm a human rights lawyer, and my context is justice, but listening to the incredible presentations about architecture and design, about how we create new opportunities to get past limits in technology and science, I hope these dynamics apply to all that we are trying to do. The first is proximity. I am persuaded that if we really want to make a difference, if we really want to break boundaries, we've got to get close to the problems. We've got to get closer to the problems than it sometimes feels comfortable doing. And a lot of times when we see big problems, we go the opposite direction. And I'm here to kind of urge us to think about the importance of getting proximate. When you hear people talking about conservation or the environment, we've got to get closer to it. Even getting closer to the problems that create economic boundaries or technological boundaries. In my work, I've understood the power of that. I grew up in a community in America in the South where black children couldn't go to the public schools. I started my education in a colored school. And the colored school in my community didn't go past the 8th grade, and many of us had no aspirations of going to high school. But then lawyers came into our community, and they got proximate, they got close, and they made them open up the public schools. And because of that, I was able to go to high school. And because of that, I was able to go to college. I went to a college that was beautiful. It was like this setting, lots of streams, lots of rivers. I had the time of my life. I was able to play sports, I was able to do music, I was a philosophy major, and I just thought that college was the way I wanted to spend the rest of my life. And I would sit by the riverbank and I would think these seemingly deep thoughts, and I was having a great experience. And then in my last year of college, somebody did something really cruel to me. They came up to me and they said, "What are you going to do after you graduate?" And for me, this was an incredibly unfair question because I hadn't thought about it. And I realized for the first time that nobody was going to pay me to philosophize when I graduated from college. And so I frantically started looking for other things to extend my education. I looked into graduate school in history and graduate school into political science and graduate school in psychology. And the truth is, if you do graduate work in the States in any of these areas, you have to know something about the field of study. And that's when I found law school. You see, the great thing about law school is you don't have to know anything to go to law school in America. And I saw that as a really wonderful opportunity, so I went. I went to Harvard Law School, and there I discovered these big problems. The United States has become a very different country over the last 40 years. In 1972, we had a prison population of 300,000. Today, we have a prison population of 2.3 million. Mass incarceration and excessive punishment have changed America. There are states where nearly a third of the young men of color have permanently lost the right to vote. The rate of incarceration of women has increased 640%. We've had 1,400 executions. We've done some incredibly destructive things, and we've, in many ways, exported them to other parts of the world. America has 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's imprisoned people. In the United States today, 1 in 3 black male babies born is expected to go to jail or prison. That wasn't true in the 19th century, that wasn't true in the 20th century. It's only become true in the 21st century. And a lot of those data make a lot of people go the opposite way. But I'm persuaded we actually have to get closer to those realities. I started working on behalf of children prosecuted unfairly. And I got involved in this after I represented a kid who was living in a house where his mother was repeatedly the target of a lot of domestic violence. Her boyfriend would get drunk and become quite abusive, and one day the man came home, and he walked into the house, and he walked up to this boy's mother, and he just punched her in the face, knocked her unconscious. She was lying on the floor, and the little boy came into the room, and he tried to revive his mom. He was a little tiny kid, he was about 5 feet tall, weighed under 100 pounds, and he couldn't get his mom to wake up. And he saw all of that blood, and he was persuaded that his mom was dead. And so he got up and he went into the bedroom where the man had fallen asleep, and he went through the dresser drawer and he pulled out the handgun that he knew the man kept there. And he took this gun and he walked over to where the man was sleeping, and he was standing there holding the gun with his hands shaking. And then the man's snoring stopped, and this little boy did something really tragic. He pulled the trigger. The man was shot in the head. He died almost instantly. Now, this child had never been in trouble before. He had actually had a good educational record. He was not some kid who had a lot of problems, and he probably would have been tried as a juvenile, except for the fact that the man he shot and killed, his mother's boyfriend, was a deputy sheriff. And because he was a deputy sheriff, the prosecutor insisted that this child be tried as an adult, and the judge certified him to stand trial as an adult, and they immediately placed him in the adult jail. His grandmother asked me to represent him, and I got to the jail about 3 days later, and when I got to the jail, this little boy came out, and he just sat there. I started asking him questions, and he wouldn't say anything. I tried to get him to talk. He wouldn't say anything. He kept staring at the wall. And finally, after 20 minutes, I put my pen down and said, look, I can't help you if you don't talk to me. You got to talk to me. Tell me what's going on. He wouldn't say a word. So I got up, and I walked around the table, and I pulled my chair close to him. I said, come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. And he just kept staring. At one point, I started leaning on him. I didn't know what else to do, and I kept saying, please talk to me. And finally, I felt him lean back. And when he leaned back, I put my arm around him. And I said, come on, tell me what's going on. And then this boy began crying hysterically. And through his sobs, he talked to me not about what happened at his house with his mom, but he talked to me about what happened at the jail. He told me on the first night he'd been assaulted by lots of men. He told me on the next night he'd been raped by several people. He told me on the night before I'd gotten there, so many people had hurt him, he couldn't remember how many there had been. And I held this little boy while he cried hysterically for almost an hour. And when I left the jail, I couldn't help but think to myself, who is responsible for this? And the answer is, we are. We've allowed narratives about children. We've allowed fear and anger to corrupt our society. And even in America, we have done something abusive and horrific. There are 250,000 children serving adult prison sentence in the United States. On any given day, we have 10,000 children under the age of 16 in an adult jail or prison where they face 5 times greater risk of suicide, 8 times greater risk of sexual violence. And for me, it's necessary to get close. We've been pushing, and we've had some success. We've persuaded the court to ban death in prison sentences for children. We have 3,000 kids in America, some as young as 13 years of age, who've been sentenced to die in prison, life imprisonment without parole. But we're making progress, and I'm going to argue that that progress is rooted in proximity, getting close to people who are suffering, people who have been challenged. Second point, I believe it's necessary to change narratives. Any good engineer, any good scientist, to make the argument that we can do more than we've done, to break boundaries, has to first understand what the narrative is about what the limits are. And then we have to change it. I don't think we can succeed in creating greater opportunity, greater justice, even a greater Sweden, unless we change the narrative of what's possible. In my country, I'm trying to change the narrative about race. I think the United States is a country that has never confronted the legacy of racial inequality. My grandmother was the daughter of people who were enslaved. If you come to the Deep South, it's very hard to find any discussion of slavery, and as a result of that, we haven't confronted it. And in my mind, slavery didn't end in America, it just evolved. It turned into something else. That period of slavery was followed by decades of terrorism, lynching and convict leasing and violence, and my grandparents were terrified by all the harms that might be done, and that terror we haven't talked about. And even the legacy of civil rights. We celebrate the civil rights movement across the world, but we don't talk about the trauma, the humiliation that people carry with them. And I'm persuaded we have to change narratives. I go to Germany and I see people trying to make sure we reflect on the legacy of the Holocaust. I go to South Africa and people are talking about truth and reconciliation, the need to reflect on the damage done by apartheid. In Rwanda, I see that same commitment in talking about the genocide there. In America, we don't do that. And wherever human rights violations persist, I believe we've got to find ways to change the narrative. Without it, we create these dramas, like the dramas you saw in Ferguson. There are these presumptions of guilt that apply to people, and you see them manifesting themselves in all different kinds of ways. We've got to change narratives. The third thing is a thing that sounds simple, but I'm persuaded may be one of the hardest. I also think that to create new opportunities to break boundaries, we actually have to find ways to be hopeful, to be purposefully thoughtful about the ways in which we will remain and committed to hopefulness. I'm persuaded that injustice persists, inequality persists, oppression exists, where hopelessness prevails. It's that kind of hopelessness that allows you to accept the kind of abuse, the kind of poverty, the kind of inequality that we have in so many parts of the world. And I'm persuaded that all of us have to find ways to stay hopeful. Václav Havel talks about the kind of hope I mean. Havel says the kind of hope we need to create a better world, to create more justice, to break boundaries, isn't that pie in the sky thing. He says it's an orientation of the spirit, a willingness to position yourself in hopeless places sometimes and be a witness. I've learned about that. I've been doing this work, representing people in prison for 30 years, and I keep waiting for the time where I don't have to make myself stay hopeful. And the truth is, it never happens. It's a constant challenge. In America, for me, I live in the South, and I sometimes see these images of the old South, and it really provokes me. Because I was excluded by Jim Crow and segregation, and my parents had opportunities taken away from them. And I've seen the pain and the humiliation that created. I don't like it in the States when we talk about the good old days. I don't like that we haven't talked about terrorism and lynching. I don't like that we haven't really contextualized civil rights and segregation. And I was going to a prison, and there was a truck outside this prison, and this truck was like a shrine to the Old South. It had all of these Confederate flags. It had these bumper stickers talking about stand your ground. It had these bumper stickers that were vaguely racist and biased and discriminatory, and it provoked me. I went into the prison to see a client I'd never met before, and this guard came out, and when I told him I was there for a legal visit, he said, "You have to get in the bathroom. I'm going to give you a strip search." A strip search is when they take off all the clothes on your body and actually go into your body cavities to make sure you're not carrying contraband. I said, "No, sir, I'm a lawyer. Lawyers don't get strip searched." He said, "If you're coming into my prison, you're going to get in that bathroom." Couldn't find anybody to help, so I had to subject myself to this humiliating search. I came back out and I said, "Look, I want to see my client." He said, "Well, you've got to go back there and sign the book." I said, "Lawyers don't have to sign the book. Let me go see my client." He said, "If you're coming into my prison, you're going to go sign that book." And so I did. Finally, I said, "Look, I want to see my client." He took me over to the door and he unlocked the door, but before I went in, he grabbed me by the arm. He said, "Did you see that truck out there with those bumper stickers and Confederate flags?" I said, "Yeah, I saw that truck." He said, "I want you to know that that's my truck." Really nasty, really difficult. It really unnerved me. And I went inside to wait for my client to come out. My client was someone I had never met before. He was a mentally disabled person. I knew that. And the client came out, and the client sat down, and the first thing the client said to me was, quote, "Did you bring me a chocolate milkshake?" Now, I thought to myself, this is the most bizarre day I've ever had in my life. I said, "What do you mean a chocolate milkshake? I'm your lawyer. I'm here to represent you. I didn't bring you a chocolate milkshake." And I started asking my questions. And I realized that my client wasn't paying any attention. And I went back and I said, "Well, I'm sorry, I didn't know they wanted me to bring you wanted me to bring you a chocolate milkshake. The next time I come, if they let me, I'll bring you a chocolate milkshake." And then he smiled. And every time I met this man, I had to tell him I tried to bring him a milkshake, but they wouldn't let me. Very disabled. Grew up in the foster care system, was in 29 foster homes by the time he was 10. Very mentally ill. He was abandoned by his parents, began showing signs of schizophrenia at 12, psychotic episodes at 14, drug addicted to crack cocaine at 16, on the streets homeless at 18, and committed a horrific crime at age 20. And no one had put on evidence about it. We have a criminal justice system in parts of the United States that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. And poor people don't get access to justice. And so this man was convicted and condemned with no evidence about his mental health. We got experts involved. We were committed to go to court and prove his mental illness. And when it came time to go to court, I got to the courtroom, and there was my client, but there was also this guard who I hadn't seen again, who had been asked to bring him to the prison. I asked my client if he was okay. He said he was fine. We put on our case. We had 3 good days of experts and evidence, and at the end of it, I felt good. And I went back to the prison after a couple of weeks to go see the client. When I got there, I saw the guard again. I saw the truck. And I almost turned around and went back home and just tried to reschedule it, but I said, "No, I'm going to go in here." And I walked into the prison, and when I walked into the prison, this guard saw me coming. And I braced myself for this confrontation. And I walked in and I said, "Hi, I'm here to see my client." And the guard said, "Hello, Mr. Stevenson, how are you?" Threw me. I said, "Well, I'll go get in the bathroom and get ready for your search." He said, "Oh, Mr. Stevenson, we don't have to do that." Threw me more. I said, "Well, I'll go back and sign the book." He said, "Mr. Stevenson, I saw you coming and I signed you in." Couldn't believe it. I said, "Well, thank you." I said, "I'd like to see my client." He said, "Come on, sir." And he took me over to the door and he unlocked the door. And before he unlocked the door and let me in, he grabbed me by the arm. He said, "Mr. Stevens, I just want to tell you something." He said, "I was in that courtroom and I was listening. And I want you to know that I think what you're doing is a good thing." He said, "I came up in the foster care system too." He said, "I didn't think anybody had it as bad as I did, and I realized I was wrong." I said, "Mr. Stevenson, I want to give you a hug." Shocked me. I could have never imagined it was possible. And he did, gave me a hug. I was about to walk inside, he grabbed me by the arm and said, "Mr. Stevens, I got to tell you something else." I said, "What's that?" So "I just want you to know I did something on the way back from the courthouse to the prison." I said, "What'd you do?" He said, "Well, I took an exit, and I took your client to a Wendy's, and I bought him a chocolate milkshake." Now, it's a really silly story, but it speaks to me about the importance of staying hopeful. We cannot achieve greatness. We cannot achieve change. We cannot achieve passing through these boundaries without being hopeful. And fourth and finally, the hardest one. I should have told you that they get harder as we go along. I believe we actually have to choose sometimes to do things that are uncomfortable. Human beings are programmed to seek comfort. You know, you come into a room like this, you look for the people you know, you gather in the spaces that feel familiar. Even as a foreigner coming to this country, I look for things that are familiar. I actually saw McDonald's. It actually comforted me to know that McDonald's was there. We're programmed to seek comfort. But the truth is, to do justice, to break boundaries, you've got to sometimes decide to do the uncomfortable. And it's challenging. But I'm persuaded without it, we cannot make differences. I owe my life and my opportunities to people who chose to protest, to resist, to boycott, to stand when everybody was telling them to sit, to speak when everybody was telling them to be quiet. And because of that, I recognize my obligation every now and then to do uncomfortable things. I was giving a talk in rural Alabama, and I went to this church. There was not a lot of people there, and I gave my talk, and there was a man in a wheelchair who was in the back of the church, and he was listening to me talk, and he was staring at me with this very hostile look on his face. I thought he was very unfriendly, but I couldn't really tell. At the end of the talk, all the people came up. They were very nice, very grateful, very generous, but this man kept sitting in the back. When everybody else left, he had this little boy wheel him up to me. And when this old man came up to me, he had the little boy pushing him. This very stern look on his face, and he came up to me, and then he raised his hand, and he said to me, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I couldn't really answer. I didn't know what he was asking me. And then he said it again. He said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And it kind of unnerved me. I just started. I couldn't figure out what to say. And then he said, "I'll tell you what you're doing." And then he said, "You're beating the drum for justice." And it moved me. He said, "You're beating the drum for justice." He said, "You keep beating that drum for justice." And then he grabbed me by my jacket and he almost pulled me into the chair. He said, "Look, look, look." He said, "You see this scar?" He said, "I got this scar on the right side of my head in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, beating the drum for justice." And then he turned his head. He said, "You see this scar?" He said, "I got that scar in Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1964, beating the drum for justice." And then he turned his head. He said, "You see this dark spot? That's my bruise. I got that bruise in Greene County, Alabama, trying to register people to vote, beating the drum for justice." And then he said to me, "People look at me and they think I have cuts and bruises and scars." And then he said, "These aren't my cuts, bruises, and scars." He said, "These are my medals of honor." And the truth is, if we're really serious about breaking boundaries, there will be these moments of uncomfort, discomfort. The cuts and scars are inevitable. My work has taught me really simple things. I believe that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. I think if somebody tells a lie, they're not just a liar. I think if somebody takes something that doesn't belong to them, they're not just a thief. I think even if you kill somebody, you're not just a killer. I'm also persuaded that in most parts of this world, I am not persuaded that the opposite of poverty is wealth. I don't believe that. I believe in many parts of this world, the opposite of poverty is justice. And when we commit ourselves to justice, then and only then can we deconstruct poverty and oppression and suffering. And finally, I believe that you have to judge the character of a society, the civility of society. You can't judge Sweden by how we treat the rich and the famous and the privileged. You can't judge any community by how you treat the rich and the privileged and the deserving. You judge the quality of life. You judge the character of a society by how you treat the poor, the incarcerated, and the condemned. I believe you've got to do uncomfortable things, not only if you're trying to do great things, not only if you're trying to break boundaries, not only if you're trying to make discoveries, but sometimes I'm persuaded that you've got to do uncomfortable things to just be healthy and human. To get to honest relationships, to get to a relationship with your environment, sometimes you've got to do those uncomfortable things. I love Sweden, I do. I think it's beautiful here. But I'm going back to Alabama. And I'm going back to Alabama because there's work that has to be done. There are challenges there, big challenges. But maybe, just maybe, I might be able to earn my own medal. My hope for you is that in some small way or in some big way, you find ways to get close, to change narratives, to be hopeful, and do uncomfortable things that increase the quotient of justice in the world, that protect human rights, that advance society for everybody. And then and only then, I'll hope for you the same thing I hope for myself, which is that you'll earn your medals too. Thank you very much. All the best to you.
you.